This story begins July 12, 2010. Florida pastor Terry Jones sends out a message on his Twitter account declaring September 11, 2010, quote, International Burn a Koran Day. Propelled along by the internet and social media, Terry Jones quickly becomes topic number one, not just by the media, but among world leaders. Not so bad for a single tweet. Now, in the end, he called off the burning, telling one news agency that he has no plans to do any such thing in the future. Regardless, many people are now left wondering how an obscure pastor can command the global stage using little else but the internet. And if Jones can do it, who and what else is next? Well, with some ideas, joining us now is Lee Rainey. Mr. Rainey is director of the Pew Internet and American Life Project, and he's joining us by Skype from his offices. Mr. Rainey, I'm reminded of the phrase, mighty oaks from little acorns grow. In your view, was Terry Jones' tweet that acorn, or maybe was there something else at work here?
Well, for acorns to grow, of course, you need good soil in which to plant it, and plentiful rainfall to grow it, and abundant sunshine. And so there are lots of elements that make that oak grow, and I think that's part of this story as well. It obviously started with a very small social media event, but mainstream media picked up on the story eventually, and that's what took it to a global scale. If you didn't have traditional media paying attention to this story and promoting it to its own audiences, there probably would have been considerably less interest in it and considerably less of an audience for it. So it's the interplay of social media and traditional media that I think made this story and lots of others like it sort of a new thing in this day and age.
Well, and of course you have experience on both ends of this spectrum. Of course you worked for a long while as a journalist. You're now studying the internet and social media. Have you seen a situation quite like this before, or was this something really new and different?
It wasn't new and different. There have been plenty of stories that started with online events. People blogged about something that mattered to them. People put it on their Facebook page. People put it on their Twitter account. And sometimes they just go viral because of that. There are other people in that social media space who pay attention to it. And eventually that viral pass-along phenomenon makes it into a big news event. But other times there are people who are paying attention to these things all the time, and in this case, it was local media in Gainesville area, and eventually a wire service that picked up the local media coverage that took this to a new plane. So I think this is a pretty good example of something that we're seeing a lot now, that something catches fire in a little way on the internet and then gets amplified in significant ways by the coverage of it in mainstream media.
Now, I'm curious why this. I did a little experiment, went to YouTube and searched for burning Korans. I'm sure many people have done this. And, there are all kinds of videos on YouTube. Even before Terry Jones was saying he was going to do this, why haven't those generated a similar response?
I think it's probably related to this phenomenon that I'm talking about of intertwining itself with mainstream media coverage. I think many of these things exist in a very small universe with a small audience of people who read a blog or look at a Facebook page or follow a particular Twitter member. But in this case, it was a series of forces, including the intervention of the mainstream media, that took this to a completely different plane. And of course, there are people now with the search functions that are available on the internet and the alert functions that are possible to sort of bake into people's lives, that there are people who can follow these things without necessarily having to pay attention to mainstream media. So there are ways in which stories like this can have international repercussions with and without traditional media, and it's sort of catch as catch can. There aren't any rules of the road that turn a small story into a big story or keep a small story a small story. It's often very conditional, very quirky, and depending on very much on local circumstances.
It was an infinitesimal portion of the American public that supported this guy. Why don't you think that the internet spread that message as widely and broadly and quickly?
Well, it was quick to point out that this guy was going to do this, and that there were people who were watching from abroad who were in deep distress over this. But you have to look at the full story played out over not so very long a time. And eventually, the outcry against this from both common citizens, government leaders, military leaders, and from abroad that forced the minister to rethink his strategy and to think about different ways to get his message out. And so in some respects, this was an explosive news story in a very short period of time, but that the final outcome in some respects reflects some of the special character of that explosiveness. There were people who reacted very quickly against this, just as there were people who reacted very quickly in favor of it. This is the new sort of instantaneous nanosecond kind of media culture that we live in now, where stories can rise and fall and live and die in relatively short periods of time, depending on who's watching and who's promoting it.
Well, and to that point, I mean, you're talking about how fast things come and go. Is it possible that everything is just simply moving too fast for us, that the internet and mobile devices and whatnot, it's just pushing so much stuff out so fast at us that we just don't have time to process it, let alone try and make anything near a good decision about it?
That's a wonderful, powerful point about the impact of these technologies on modern life. And I think a lot of people are very concerned. That shows up in our research all the time. They think that there are events that they need to know about that are happening without them knowing about them. They think that their competitors or others in their social circles are learning about things quickly. There's just an overwhelming sense that the volume of information, the velocity of information, the variety of different places from which information can originate are overwhelming. We've basically got to get better filters to make sure that the most important stuff, the most relevant stuff, the most interesting stuff gets into our lives. But technology hasn't yet done that, and our social networks are only sort of haltingly moving towards that. And so we're going through this period of ferment about this that will eventually sort itself out, but we're right now right in the middle of the storm.
And in the meantime, do you ever worry that the potential exists for a story that is even more serious than the one we saw here? I mean, several months ago we saw, one individual, a Department of Agriculture person who, a rumor went around the net. She was fired like that by the administration. Turned out the rumor was completely false. That was one person that suffered. This story comes along. A lot of people have been sort of aggrieved by it, but fortunately there wasn't that much sort of problems or issues with it. Do you worry that we may be in a spot where something really bad could happen really fast?
Of course, and we actually have seen episodes of that where literally rumors have started based on false information and have been fueled so quickly by these new media that there have been riots and people have died because of false information or misinformation that was being spread around communities. A couple of months ago, we had an instantaneous stock crash because of the way that this communication system has now become a hair trigger system. So there are real impacts that are being felt in really consequential ways, both in people's safety in their lives as well as their financial lives. This is a very different world yet, and we haven't yet worked out all of the rules about what should be regulated, how markets should respond, and what our social expectations should be. I mean, should we pay attention to things that move really quickly and our text systems or our email systems or in our alert systems, or how do we account for these various things in our life without overreacting to them? And I don't think we've yet worked out as a society what the right rules of the road ought to be.
Right. They called that the flash crash. I wonder if we're in the era of flash news now. Last question to you. I'm wondering if you think that there's a way that, I don't like the phrase, but the internet can be used more for sort of the teachable moment. In other words, ways to find that the internet that can very quickly teach perhaps the Western world about Muslims' view about the physical text of the Quran, and vice versa, a moment where the Muslim world could learn about the American ideals of protected free speech. How do we make that happen?
I'm not sure that it's clear how we can make that happen. It's obviously a good thing not to overreact, and it's obviously a good thing to check out information no matter where it's come from, even if it's come from someone in your social network that you almost impeccably trust. It's good to be skeptical and good to be open to new ideas. And the long-term evidence suggests that people who are open to diverse sources of information, who have broad networks, who have open minds, and who are available in lots of ways to lots of people, they just have happier lives and healthier lives, and then sometimes they have more prosperous lives. So there are ways in which being smart, being deliberate, being skeptical, being smart about how you interact with information can have real payoffs, and we just have to teach each other more of those lessons.
Well, we'll be paying attention for those lessons. Lee Rainey, thank you so much for joining us.